In every violent crime, there exists a complex intersection between personal history, psychology, and circumstance. This case presents one such tragic convergence, where a relationship dissolved into escalating hostility, culminating in the ultimate, irreversible act. What begins as a seemingly ordinary domestic dispute develops into a chain of decisions and denials, each compounding the gravity of the situation. What follows is an examination of one fatal night, the contradictions revealed in an interrogation room, and the eventual dismantling of a defense built upon shaky foundations. The incident unfolded during a late winter evening in a modest residence. A call to emergency services reported a physical altercation between two individuals engaged in an intimate relationship. Responding officers arrived quickly, only to discover one woman lying motionless on the floor, unresponsive, and already beyond the help of paramedics. Despite their best efforts, she was pronounced deceased at the scene. The other woman involved, still present and coherent, was escorted into custody for questioning. What she did not realize at that moment was how every word, every hesitation, and every choice of language would become part of the puzzle investigators would later piece together. From the outset, the surviving partner attempted to frame the incident as an act of self-defense. She explained that the situation had escalated only because she had been trying to leave the home peacefully, and that the knife she had held was intended not for violence but as a means of escape. She claimed she had cut a window screen in an attempt to flee the residence, and in the process of trying to push herself through the window, her partner had approached, placed hands on her back, and forced physical contact. It was at this moment, she asserted, that she turned with the knife and delivered a single slashing motion. She insisted she had not intended to cause serious harm, and that her only objective was to get away from what she described as a volatile, dangerous situation. Yet, even in this early account, contradictions began to appear. She emphasized repeatedly that she did not know how to use knives beyond basic kitchen tasks. Yet she also admitted she had armed herself with one before any physical confrontation began. She described her act as a singular cut, casual in its delivery. Yet the forensic evidence would reveal something far more devastating. Investigators, while maintaining a calm and non-confrontational approach, allowed her to expand upon her version of events, knowing that inconsistencies would inevitably emerge. The language she used was itself revealing. She consistently referred to her actions as a cut, never as a stab, thrust, or attack. The word choice downplayed the violence, suggesting something accidental or incidental. But forensic pathologists would later determine that the victim had suffered between 7 and 8 deep penetrating wounds, including injuries to the wrists, which are commonly recognized as defensive wounds, as well as critical lacerations to the neck and torso. The degree and number of wounds could not be reconciled with the suspect's claim of a single slash. Equally troubling was her demeanor during interrogation. Detectives noted that she appeared unusually calm, almost detached, occasionally even laughing during her account. At no point did she ask whether the other woman had survived or express concern for her condition. Her focus remained fixed on her own position, the inconvenience of repeated calls to law enforcement earlier in the day, and the frustration of having to defend her actions. While emotional responses can vary widely in moments of trauma, the absence of any expressed remorse or empathy stood out starkly against the gravity of the situation. The context of the relationship added further complexity. The pair had known each other only for a short period, a matter of months. Yet in that time, tensions had escalated quickly. Friends of the deceased later reported that disputes often centered on control, jealousy, and unresolved financial matters. On the evening in question, the victim had sought repayment of money she was owed, traveling to confront her partner after learning where she was spending the evening. What began as an argument in front of friends soon followed the couple back to the residence they had shared for little more than a week. Their tempers flared, and the confrontation spiraled out of control. The suspect insisted she had attempted to resolve matters peacefully, claiming she had called emergency services multiple times throughout the day, requesting assistance in removing her partner from the home. Phone records confirmed that she had indeed made calls to law enforcement earlier, though the precise content and urgency of those calls became an important point of scrutiny. In her mind, those calls served as evidence that she had attempted to avoid conflict and had sought institutional help. In the eyes of investigators, however, they were insufficient to explain the violent escalation that followed. Another aspect of the story that raised suspicion was her handling of her mobile phone. She claimed to have deliberately left it in her car out of fear that her partner would damage it during an argument, suggesting she prioritized protecting the device over ensuring she had the ability to call for help in a crisis. This decision contradicted her broader narrative of fearing for her safety. If she genuinely felt endangered, investigators reasoned, why would she intentionally deprive herself of her primary lifeline to emergency assistance? The interview continued, with detectives pressing gently but firmly on these contradictions. They asked her to demonstrate how she had held the knife and to describe the motion she had made. She gestured with a slashing movement from right to left, a motion inconsistent with the multiple thrusting wounds identified later. They asked how she had injured her thumb, a deep laceration observed on her hand. She claimed ignorance, suggesting she must have accidentally cut herself. But forensic experts knew such injuries are common among attackers whose hands slip on the handle of a knife during forceful stabbing motions. The suspect further claimed that she had blacked out during the incident, remembering only the initial slash and her partner falling to the ground. Yet she provided specific details about the victim's position near the window, the direction of her fall, and even described her face contorting and moving afterward. This selective memory appeared less like the genuine gaps associated with dissociation and more like an attempt to minimize culpability, while still offering just enough detail to appear cooperative. After the stabbing, rather than calling for immediate medical assistance, she fled the residence. She went to the home of friends, recounted a vague version of events, and sought to distance herself from the scene. When asked why she did not remain with the victim or call for help, she insisted she had already exhausted those avenues, repeating that earlier calls to law enforcement had gone unanswered. To investigators, this behavior indicated not panic but calculation, an effort to control the narrative before authorities arrived. As the interrogation progressed, detectives gradually revealed the strength of the evidence against her. They informed her that the injuries observed at the scene were far more extensive than her story accounted for. They explained that the victim had lost a significant amount of blood, that there were numerous wounds, and that none could have been self-inflicted. Faced with this information, the suspect wavered. At one point she admitted it was 50-50 whether she may have inflicted more than one injury, later suggesting perhaps her partner had somehow contributed to her own wounds in the chaos. These explanations strained credulity and further eroded her claim of self-defense. The broader psychological portrait that emerged was one of a woman more concerned with maintaining control of the narrative than grappling with the reality of what had occurred. Her repeated assertion that she had tried to get out of the relationship, her insistence that she had no choice, and her casual laughter all painted the picture of someone detached from the consequences of her actions. Whether this detachment reflected shock, denial, or deeper traits of callousness, the impression left on investigators was unmistakable. The case proceeded to trial, where prosecutors presented forensic evidence, phone records, witness testimony, and the interrogation footage. Jurors were shown the calm demeanor, the repeated minimization of violence, and the contradictions between her words and the physical evidence. The defense attempted to maintain the narrative of self-defense, highlighting prior tensions in the relationship and the suspect's earlier calls for help, but the weight of evidence proved overwhelming. The pattern of injuries, the lack of immediate aid, the implausible explanations all combined to dismantle any reasonable claim that this was a defensive act. Ultimately, the jury delivered a guilty verdict for second-degree murder. The court imposed a sentence of 20 years in prison without the possibility of bail, reflecting both the severity of the crime and the absence of genuine remorse. For the family of the deceased, the outcome offered some measure of accountability, though never the restoration of a life taken too soon. This case underscores several recurring themes in intimate partner homicides. First, the volatility of relationships, marked by control and unresolved disputes, can escalate rapidly into violence. Second, attempts to frame deadly force as defensive often unravel under forensic scrutiny, particularly when the physical evidence contradicts claims of minimal harm. Third, the demeanor and language of a suspect, while not determinative in themselves, can powerfully influence perceptions of credibility and empathy. In this instance, the lack of visible grief or concern amplified the doubts already cast by contradictory statements. Moreover, the case illustrates the critical role of investigative interviewing. Detectives did not confront the suspect aggressively. Instead, they created space for her to elaborate, knowing that inconsistencies would emerge organically. They balanced empathy with persistence, gradually confronting her with the facts until her narrative could no longer withstand examination. This approach not only preserved the integrity of the interrogation, but also provided jurors with clear evidence of deception and evasion. Beyond the immediate tragedy, the case raises broader questions about intervention and prevention. Domestic disputes rarely appear suddenly. They build through patterns of conflict, control, and escalation. Friends and relatives often recognize the warning signs, but may lack the means or confidence to intervene. Law enforcement, too, faces challenges in responding to repeated calls for assistance in disputes that may not initially involve violence, but hold the potential to escalate. The difficulty lies in distinguishing between conflicts that will dissipate and those that may culminate in fatal outcomes. The suspect, in this case, framed herself as someone abandoned by the system, insisting she had tried repeatedly to summon help, but received no meaningful response. Whether or not this perception was accurate, it reflects a sentiment not uncommon in cases of domestic turmoil. The sense of being unheard or unsupported can feed a narrative of justification when violence occurs, even though the ultimate responsibility remains with the individual who chooses to escalate force. In the end, this case reveals the fragility of narratives constructed in the aftermath of violence. Words alone cannot obscure the truth etched into wounds, blood patterns, and forensic evidence. Attempts to downplay responsibility, to soften language, or to feign confusion fall apart when confronted with the physical realities of injury and death. The story told in the interrogation room was one of minimization and denial. The story told by the body, by the scene, and by the scientific evidence was one of deliberate, repeated, and fatal violence. The justice system, in this instance, served to reconcile those competing narratives, weighing testimony against evidence, demeanor against fact, and ultimately delivering a verdict grounded in reality rather than fabrication. It is a sobering reminder that beneath every statistic of domestic homicide lies a complex interplay of relationships, choices, and consequences, and that once violence crosses the threshold into lethality, no amount of explanation can undo the finality of the act. For the broader community, the lesson is not only in the recognition of danger signs, but in the importance of consistent, effective intervention. The difference between a volatile relationship and a fatal one may rest in timely support, in proactive responses to early calls for help, and in the willingness of those close to intervene before tragedy strikes. While no system can prevent every act of violence, the patterns revealed in cases like this highlight the points where intervention may make the greatest difference. The outcome of this trial does not erase the loss or the pain felt by those connected to the deceased. It does, however, affirm that accountability matters, that the truth cannot be obscured by rehearsed narratives, and that the justice system, imperfect though it may be, can bring clarity where deception attempts to sow confusion. The surviving partner believed she could outsmart investigators by shaping her words carefully, by insisting on self-defense, and by presenting herself as calm and rational. Yet the truth revealed itself through every contradiction, every implausible explanation, and every wound that spoke louder than her words. This case will be remembered not only for the tragedy of a life cut short, but for the insight it provides into the ways human beings attempt to rationalize the irrational, to excuse the inexcusable, and to deny the undeniable. It stands as a stark reminder that in the aftermath of violence, the search for truth requires patience, persistence, and an unwavering commitment to evidence over narrative.